Welcome to my channel, Vibes of Life. In today's video, we're diving deep into something most people never question, until they have to. Is cremation a sin? It all started with a quiet conversation in a dimly lit church basement after a Wednesday night Bible study. John, a lifelong believer in his late 50s, had just lost his younger brother to a sudden heart attack. The family was torn between tradition and modern convenience. His brother had left no instructions: burial, cremation. The pastor offered kind words but not much guidance. That night, as the room emptied, John leaned in and asked what he thought was a simple question. Does the Bible say anything about cremation? Silence. A glance. Then a long pause. And finally, "That's more complicated than you think." That one sentence stuck in John's mind like a splinter. For days, he couldn't shake it. What did he mean by complicated? Aren't we supposed to return to dust anyway? Isn't cremation just speeding up the process? Isn't it just practical? But what John didn't know, and what most Christians today have never been told, is that the Bible doesn't just speak in silence. Sometimes it speaks in patterns, in stories, in moments we overlook because they're too close, too familiar. And sometimes the truth it tells is not the one we want to hear. As John searched through Scripture, asked questions and uncovered historical layers, something strange started to happen. Verses he'd read for years suddenly looked different. Details in the Old Testament, ancient burial practices, even the words of Jesus. They all started to form a bigger picture, and at the heart of it was a question far deeper than cremation or burial. What does the way we treat the body say about what we believe about the soul? This journey took him beyond dusty commentaries and into ancient Jewish customs, early church debates, and even the writings of C.S. Lewis himself. In one of his lesser-known letters, Lewis explored how modern conveniences can subtly reshape sacred values without us even realizing it. Was cremation one of those? And if so, what does that mean for believers today? In this video, we're going to explore 4 shocking biblical truths about cremation that most Christians have never been taught. These aren't just facts. They're questions that will make you rethink what you thought you knew. Questions that challenge not only how we handle death, but how we understand resurrection, dignity, and eternity. But before we get into those truths, you need to hear what John discovered one night in a forgotten passage from the Old Testament, a moment so raw, so strange, and so direct that it left him speechless. He never looked at cremation the same way again, and once you hear it, you might not either. John sat alone that night, Bible open, flipping through the pages not just for comfort, but for clarity. He wasn't a theologian. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He just needed answers. Honest ones. As the wind tapped against the window pane, he landed on 1 Samuel 31, the story of King Saul's death. A familiar story, but this time something strange stood out. After Saul died in battle, his body was taken by the people of Jabesh Gilead, and what did they do? They burned it. John leaned back in his chair, confused. Wait, they burned the body of a king? He thought cremation was frowned upon in the Bible, but here it was, right in front of him. So, was this a sign that cremation was accepted, or was it something else? The passage didn't give a clear explanation, and that unsettled him. He looked deeper, reading what scholars said, and realized this act wasn't a norm. It was an exception. A desperate moment in a time of war, with decaying bodies exposed to the elements. It wasn't about theology, it was about necessity. Still, that one moment opened a door, and John couldn't close it anymore. He started seeing how burial, actual physical burial, was everywhere in Scripture. Abraham buried Sarah. Jacob gave exact instructions about where he wanted to be buried. Joseph made his family promise to carry his bones out of Egypt and lay them to rest in the promised land. Even Jesus, after his crucifixion, was wrapped in linen and placed in a tomb. Burial wasn't just tradition, it was sacred, personal, deliberate. But then, why was cremation becoming so common now? Not just among the secular world, but even in the church. The more he talked to fellow believers, the more he heard the same reasons. It's cheaper. It's quicker. It doesn't matter. God can raise us no matter what. Practical answers, reasonable ones. But John began to sense a deeper disconnect. Had we become so focused on convenience that we stopped asking what it means? Late one evening, John found an old essay by C.S. Lewis. In it, Lewis warned of what he called the abolition of reverence, a slow forgetting of what makes something sacred. Not by attacking it, but by replacing it with something easier, something more modern. Reading those words hit John like a quiet thunder. Was this what was happening now? And just when he thought he'd reached the bottom of it all, he came across something in the New Testament, a connection that tied everything together. Something hidden in plain sight, yet few talk about it. He couldn't unsee it. And once you hear it, you might not be able to either. John couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something bigger than just a question about burial. Every time he tried to move on, something would pull him back. Another verse, another conversation, another quiet nudge in his spirit. One Sunday after church, he brought it up during coffee hour, just casually. "Have you ever thought about what the Bible really says about cremation?" he asked an older woman who'd lost her husband 2 years earlier. Her smile faded. "I had him cremated," she said softly, almost apologetically. "It's what we could afford, and I don't think God minds. He knows our hearts." That stayed with John too. What if this wasn't just about theology, but about pain, about economics, about grief? It seemed like every Christian he spoke to had a different angle. Some were firm. Cremation dishonors the body. Others were more open. It's just a shell. We're souls. But no one seemed to have clear biblical teaching. Just fragments, feelings, opinions. He remembered what he read in C.S. Lewis' letters, how subtle shifts in culture often change faith without anyone noticing. Cremation had become normal, not through scripture, but through silence, through habit, through comfort. John's pastor, when asked again, finally admitted something that surprised him. The Bible doesn't have a direct command against cremation, but it does paint a picture of burial, of honor, of resurrection. That matters. That word, resurrection, kept echoing in John's mind. If we believe in a bodily resurrection, what does that mean for how we treat the body now? Still, the deeper he looked, the more contradictions he found. Were we honoring the dead, or just making decisions that felt right in the moment? One night, John came across a passage he'd never really noticed before, and what it revealed left him cold. John stared at the verse glowing back at him from his screen, 1 Corinthians 15. He'd read it before, countless times during Easter services and funerals, but this time the words felt different. The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. He read it again, slower. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. That phrase, sown in dishonor, stopped him cold. What if Paul wasn't just being poetic? What if he was pointing to something real, something sacred about how the body is handled after death? The weight of that question pressed into John like a stone. Suddenly the debate around cremation wasn't just theological, it felt deeply personal. What if we were unintentionally treating the body with dishonor, thinking it didn't matter, when all along it did? What if we were unknowingly drifting from a pattern God had set from the beginning? He started researching more. Not just the Bible, but the early church, the writings of the apostles, the burial traditions that Christians had practiced for centuries. Again and again, he saw a consistent thread: reverence for the body, a waiting, a hope tied not just to the soul but to the future of the body itself. But then, just when things were starting to make sense, John came across a modern theologian who said something that turned everything upside down. The method of the body's return to the earth, the scholar wrote, may not be the question. The deeper issue is whether we treat death as a holy moment or just another task to complete. That line struck him like lightning. Had cremation become so routine, so matter-of-fact, that we stopped seeing death as sacred? John's heart pounded. He closed the book slowly, his hands trembling, and then the phone rang. It was his niece. There'd been another death in the family, and this time they were asking him to decide. John didn't answer right away. His niece's voice was shaky on the other end of the line. Her father, John's older brother, had passed unexpectedly in his sleep. The shock hadn't settled yet, but plans had to be made. "Uncle John," she said softly, "you're the only one in the family who really thinks about this stuff. What should we do? Should we have him cremated?" John froze. Every thought, every verse, every conversation over the last few weeks flashed through his mind. But now it wasn't just study or theory. It was real. His family was waiting for an answer. He looked around the room, Bible still open, Lewis' book beside it, and that lingering line about death being holy. His chest tightened. He couldn't just give a yes or no. He had to be honest. "I need a moment," he said. After the call, John sat still for what felt like an hour. This wasn't just about theology anymore. This was about responsibility, about leading. And suddenly, all the uncertainty he thought he'd sorted through came crashing back. Then came the second twist, one he didn't expect. His niece called again later that night, more emotional than before. "Uncle John," she whispered, "Dad had a letter. We found it in his desk. He left instructions." John's stomach sank. What did it say? He said he wanted to be buried, not cremated. He said it was important to him spiritually, but he didn't want to make a big deal out of it if it caused conflict. So he never brought it up. The room spun slightly. Of all the things John had prepared for, this wasn't one of them. The family had already booked the cremation for the following morning. Everything was moving fast. No one had known about the letter until now, and changing plans at this stage would mean costs, paperwork, and uncomfortable conversations, the kind that break families apart. John looked down at the letter his niece had sent him. His brother's handwriting was shaky but clear. The words were simple. "Please bury me if you can. I believe it matters, not just to me, but to God." The weight of the decision now rested entirely on John. Time was running out. His brother's last wish was on paper. But would anyone listen, or would convenience win again? And worse, what if speaking up came at the cost of tearing his family apart? John barely slept that night. Every hour that passed pushed the weight deeper into his chest. By sunrise, he had made his decision. He dressed quietly, grabbed his car keys, and drove straight to his niece's house. When she opened the door, her face was pale from crying. "Everyone's already on the way to the crematorium," she said. "But I don't know what to do anymore." John handed her the printed letter. "You don't have to decide alone," he said, "but your dad already did." She read it again, this time slower. Her hands trembled. "I didn't even know he felt this way." "No one did," John said, "but he wrote it down for a reason." They sat together in silence. Then, in a whisper, she said, "We'll stop the cremation. I'll call them now." What followed was a storm. Not everyone in the family agreed. Some were angry, some were confused. There were arguments, frustrations over last-minute changes, costs and delays. But John stayed steady. He didn't preach. He didn't shame. He simply told them what their brother had asked for and what he believed it meant. 3 days later, they held a simple burial in the small family plot where their parents were laid to rest. As the casket was lowered into the ground, John stood still, his heart heavy, but not with guilt, with peace. He realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about cremation or burial. It was about honoring the sacred, even when it's inconvenient. It was about choosing reverence over routine. And more than anything, it was about listening, really listening to what someone believes, even after they're gone. As the final prayer ended, John reached into his pocket. He had brought a small book of C.S. Lewis essays with him, the one that had changed his view weeks earlier. Tucked inside the pages was a church bulletin from years ago, one he didn't even remember saving. He opened it and froze. Scrawled in the margin in his brother's handwriting were the words, "Bodies matter, resurrection is coming." John's breath caught in his throat. He'd thought the story was over, but maybe it was just beginning. The wind was soft that afternoon, brushing through the trees as the family quietly began to leave the cemetery. John stayed behind for a while, standing at the edge of the freshly turned earth. The finality of the moment settled deep in his chest, but it wasn't heavy with sadness anymore. There was something sacred in what had happened, something healing. His brother's quiet wish had been heard, honored, and carried out with love, even in the middle of tension and confusion. Later that evening, John sat on his porch with a warm cup of coffee and watched the sky shift to twilight. He kept thinking about that note in the bulletin. Bodies matter, resurrection is coming. That one sentence had tied everything together. The scriptures he had read, the uncomfortable conversations, the doubts, the sudden letter, all of it pointed to one deep, steady truth. The body is not just a shell. It's part of the story God is telling. And how we handle it, even in death, reflects what we believe about life, dignity, and eternity. John wasn't angry at people who chose cremation. He understood why many did. Sometimes it came from financial pressure, sometimes from lack of clarity, and sometimes just from habit. But now he saw why the Bible's consistent pattern of burial wasn't about legalism. It was about meaning. It was about hope. It was about the promise that this body, broken though it may be, would one day be raised in glory. He thought about how many other Christians like him had never been told the full story. The topic of cremation is rarely talked about in churches. It's often passed over with the idea that God can resurrect us no matter what, which is true, but maybe too simple. Maybe it's time we look deeper, not to judge, but to understand. John knew that sharing what he had learned wouldn't be easy. It would bring questions, maybe even disagreement. But now, with his brother's letter in one hand and scripture in the other, he felt a quiet courage, a calling to speak, not just about death, but about what comes after. Because the real truth he discovered wasn't just about cremation, it was about resurrection. And that changed everything.